Bye.
Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 17th of December 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio once again, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Mike.
Just say congratulations, Patrick, for graduating with an MSc in International Relations on Friday.
Thank you very much. Then thanks you guys as well for attending the ceremony. That's the culmination of 18 months of a lot of hard work, balancing with my work here at the UK Column and also 21st Century Wire and other freelance work. And it's been quite a challenging year, Mike, and we appreciate all of your understanding and support, moral support throughout the last year and a half. Thank you.
Yep, good. Okay. Well, look, let's move straight on then with Brexit. And, well, Patrick, it looks like we've got some good news on the cards because, well, Owen Paterson here tweeting out a quote from Boris Johnson's Telegraph article today, saying it's highly encouraging that at last some cabinet ministers are coming around to the idea of a managed no deal as the best way forward in Brexit. As for this babble about another referendum, it undermines our negotiating credibility further. So what is he talking about? Well, apparently Penny Mordaunt, here she is going to say she's going to deliver Brexit because she's going to deliver a managed no deal should she ever become leader of the Tory party. So she's got behind this idea of a managed no deal. So what on earth are we talking about? Secret talks apparently with key members of the European Research Group. Of course, this is Jacob Rees-Mogg's group, and they're talking about a managed no deal, but there can't really be any such thing, Patrick, as a managed no deal, because of course it's either a no deal or it isn't. A managed no deal means that there has to be some kind of deal, whether that be deals on the sidelines, and we'll come on to one of those in a second, or otherwise it's not a no deal.
So a managed no deal is really a deal.
It is a deal, yes.
Right.
It is a deal of some kind. Now, what, of course, one of the things that people are a bit confused about is the possibility of the transition arrangement. This is a 2-year period following withdrawal. But of course, that transition agreement is part of the withdrawal agreement. So if there's no withdrawal agreement, then there is no transition. And of course, there are a whole host of issues regarding a hard Brexit. What happens to trade? Well, then we might fall back to World Trade Organization rules. Okay, so perhaps that aspect is sorted out to some degree. But what about flights? There has to be some kind of deal with regard to flights. What about fishing? There has to be some kind of deal with regard to fishing. A managed no deal means that
It solves all those problems,
it
right?
solves all the problems because the deal is done behind closed doors and there's no parliamentary scrutiny on it. So anyway, that's what Penny Mordaunt wants to do. But in the meantime, everybody will be pleased to know that we have a trade deal with the Swiss. Now, this is very important. This has been organised. The UK government and the Swiss Federal Council have approved the transition of a trade deal, allowing businesses to continue trading freely after the UK leaves the European Union. This is the first and one of the most significant existing trade agreements to the UK to have been agreed as part of the government's preparations to ensure continuity for business and consumers as we leave the EU. There are around 40 existing EU trade agreements that the UK government is seeking to provide continuity for, and as a number of other agreements are at an advanced stage. But of course, it's extremely important that the Swiss one comes first. Now, this article is from 2013, but it perhaps gives us a clue why the Swiss one is so important. The headline here is UK gold exports to Switzerland surge as investors sell exchange-traded funds. Some of the trade statistics from the last few months have demonstrated that there has been further outflows of gold from the country, and that's helped with the trade deficit figures. So I think it's important that we set up this trade agreement with the Swiss. That's the first one that we've done, because otherwise we can't expatriate our gold before Brexit, before the mess over the next few months and the financial chaos that may ensue.
And here I was thinking that was all about knives and watches, Mike. Apparently not.
Apparently not.
So what's interesting, though, just before we go, Mike, is that the status that Switzerland has within Europe and the status that the UK may have, if indeed a Brexit transition goes through, will have some similarities in terms of their being financial centers, but also having themselves sit above a lot of the other structures in terms of finance. I'm talking about deregulation, Mike. Although Switzerland is heavily regulated in many ways, even in the financial sector, there are regulations in Switzerland that aren't in other countries. But the City of London could potentially become a haven for deregulation, for derivatives, leveraging, and all sorts of financial instruments, Mike, in the future. So this is something that could beckon with, if Brexit is successful, that there will be more funny money and games being.
Not sure how there could be any more funny money and games, but I take your point.
Never say never.
Never say never. Well, look, what are we talking about here? The possibility of a no deal and the possibility of a second referendum. So look, there can be no deal because nobody is going to support that. They're not going to support it because of the City of London is a pretty major reason why they're not going to support it. So what are we looking at? Really, this is about building a narrative towards a second referendum. Mm-hmm. But of course, we can't just rely on our politicians to build that narrative for us. We've got to have others building that narrative for us. The Russians going to build that narrative, do you think?
Well, according to the BBC and others, no. Apparently, Russia engineered Brexit, according to our news media.
Okay, so we'll come on to that in a second. So if it's not Russia, I wonder who it could be. So let's have a look at this.
Everyone knows who won, but not everyone knows how.
We are about to ask the biggest question in a generation. In or out? And we need a leader.
We need to understand who our voters are.
Appeal to their hearts. People are feeling angrier, ignored.
Is it immigration? You could be honest. Is it race? Which countries don't you like?
New people come in, we get squeezed out.
We want to return to a time when we knew our place, when things made sense. Fictional or not. How to change the course of history.
We have to hack the political system.
Hack it.
I'm talking about altering the matrix of politics.
Social media platforms are designed to find like-minded people. Our software will locate and target people that no campaign has ever targeted before. People who don't and have never voted. 3 million extra votes that the other side have no idea exist.
Okay, so I'm not going to show any more of that. That's enough. If anybody wants to go and see the whole trailer for the new HBO Brexit movie or miniseries or whatever it's going to be, you can find it. It's easy enough to find. But what is going on here, Patrick? Because HBO, as far as I know, is not Russian-owned. But this seems to be an effort by some people to produce a narrative. Now, if we look at some of the other narrative that we've seen along these lines, well, this is Christopher Wylie, the ex-Facebook employee. Ex-Cambridge Analytica employee. Thank you for that. And Patrick, he seems to be running with more or less the same narrative here. This is a couple of tweets over a period of time. So this is July and November. So, you know, he's been running with this narrative for quite some time, and it looks like HBO is starting to try to build public perception of the same type of narrative.
Well, actually, the production for that HBO series, Mike, would have really been set in motion, I would say, at least 12 months ago.
Right.
And so in terms of filming, probably at least 6 months ago. So you can see this tweet by Chris Wylie here. He's the so-called whistleblower for Cambridge Analytica. That was July this past summer, and that's been pinned to his Twitter page, Mike, for the last 6 months. But basically the narrative is, I went to work for Cambridge Analytica and I regret it, and Brexit was illegal because Leave EU broke the law. And so the same and the Russians were involved in Brexit, the Russians were involved with Trump, And this is the narrative that he's been anointed by the establishment as the kind of go-to source for all things to do with Cambridge Analytica and Brexit and so forth. But notice how the Cambridge Analytica scandal just came out of nowhere, Mike, in the winter, and nobody really questioned why this was being elevated to such a high degree. I mean, yes, there was a data breach, yes, but then the European data laws came in immediately after that, Mike, and that started a kind of compartmentalization of the internet. You noticed a lot of US sites are not available to British and European audiences because of these new data regulations that suddenly came sweeping into place after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Mike. And so everyone's kind of conveniently blaming Facebook, and Facebook is evil. And yes, there's some credence to that criticism with Facebook, but you have to look at the timing of this. The fact that these people are framing the Russians and then saying that the referendum results were illegitimate because of data, because they were targeting using data mining and targeting vulnerable voting groups or people who were uneducated voters. These are similar talking points to what we heard right after the referendum, was that these people aren't smart enough to be voting on something so important. So that's what people like Christopher Wylie are reinforcing.
And now HBO coming with this narrative. Now that's due to be released on the 19th of January, right in the middle of the debate about whether there's going to be a second referendum or how the heck we're going to move this Brexit process forward. Could we not say that that is manipulation of politics?
100%. This was at least, in terms of a production, Mike, looking at the Brexit film here, starring Benedict Cumberpatch, just his fee alone, I can't imagine how many millions of pounds it is, but I would say this production would be hovering between, I don't know, around 20 million, 25 million or something like that in terms of cost. Now, these sort of 20 million pound media projects don't just pop out of nowhere, Mike, by happenstance. These are planned, these are calculated. The political messaging in this HBO film is very specific. This is designed to nudge the audience and to nudge the public to a certain set of conclusions and to make them believe that the reason Brexit came about was because of X, Y, and Z. This is the job of this film. And therefore, it's looking for a call to action, Mike, at the end. What is the call to action of this marketing piece, which is masquerading as a film, starring Ben Cumberbatch? This is a political marketing thing. This is the exact same thing they're accusing Cambridge Analytica of doing, which is manipulating public opinion through targeted messaging, except this is being done through a mainstream Hollywood-level production. What's the call to action? Second referendum?
Second referendum.
So is that going to be successful, Mike, or not? That's the question.
Well, as I say, I think a no deal is not an option. I think there are many, many reasons why that is, but there's simply not support for it in the House of Commons. They're trying to rebadge what a no deal would mean, but it's still not going to fly. And therefore, there's going to be increasing calls, I believe, for a second referendum. Now, a month or two ago, the UCL Constitution Unit, the University College London Constitution Unit, produced a document all about a second referendum, as they would. And the key points were: a new referendum requires legislation ensuring proper scrutiny of this and adequate preparation for the poll would take at least 22 weeks. This would demand an extension of the Article 50 period. Well, we know that that's not really a problem. There are various trigger points for a referendum. Parliament could demand a referendum in return for approving the government's deal with the EU, or impose it in the event of a no deal to avoid the UK crashing out without a deal. This is exactly my point. Some politicians would advocate a yes-no referendum on the deal, but this would be unwise. The report also dismisses a two-stage poll, as some others have proposed, and concludes that the deal versus no deal poll is unlikely. So it goes on, but here's a couple of the key points. The franchise for the referendum should be the same as in June 2016 to avoid the risk that a changed franchise alters the result. So they're saying that we shouldn't suddenly bring 16-year-olds into this, as some people have called for. But here's the key one: referendum regulation should be updated to account for online campaigning. So here we go. We produce a huge propaganda piece starring Dominic Cumberbatch, a long-time Remainer, by the way.
Benedict Cumberbatch.
Sorry, Benedict Cumberbatch, thank you. And at the same time, the whole premise of that thing is that there's been manipulation of Brexit as a result of online campaigning and use of social media. And suddenly the University College London suggesting that there should be new regulations with the next referendum to make sure that that can't happen again. So what does that mean? Does that mean that campaign groups like Vote Leave or Leave Means Leave or whoever it is would not be allowed to campaign using social media at all? Does that mean that the narrative is then restricted to what we see on the television, on the BBC, in the Guardian, in the Telegraph? No communications between campaign groups, just what's on the television.
Well, I think it's going to be worse than that, Mike. By the way, I think Ben Cumberpatch is playing Dominic Cummings, who is the director.
Right, sorry,
that's how you got that mixed up.
Yeah,
so
okay.
he's playing that character,
Right.
Dominic Cummings, who is the director of the campaign Leave EU.
Vote Leave.
Yeah, Vote Leave or Leave EU.
Yeah.
So he's playing that role. So I think what you're talking about in terms of online campaigning, Mike, this gives the government an entree into sort of regulating social media. And they won't do it evenly handed, Mike, on both sides of the issue. They'll specifically be doing it on the side which they could say attach Russian interference to. So, for instance, in the case of Brexit, the conspiracy theory, the official conspiracy theory, pushed by government, pushed by mainstream media, pushed by the Integrity Initiative, Quango, clandestine networks, are that the Russians influenced Brexit, or so Putin's behind Brexit or something like this. So if you can get that idea to permeate through government, then that will sort of raise the question on the floor of the House of Commons. So what are we going to do about Russian interference in the referendum vote? And so then the government ministers will then call Facebook, and Facebook will come marching along as they do gleefully into the offices in Westminster or in Washington or wherever and say, yes sir, 3 bags full, sir. Just let us operate and make lots of money in your market. We'll do whatever you say. Do you want us to use algorithms to mute and censor and get rid of certain types of comments? Yeah, we'll do that for you. Don't you worry. So it's not going to be done even-handed, because we saw, Mike, before the U.S. midterms, 2018 elections, Facebook went and purged conservative accounts or people affiliated with the Republican Party. And so that was done in sort of the battle to fight fake news and other nefarious crusades. But basically, Facebook and Twitter are overwhelmingly favoring one side of the political discussion. There's no doubt about that. So I don't think this would be enforced evenly. Based on previous records, Mike, it's not going to be enforced even-handedly, despite what any government minister says or any guarantees that are given, Mike. You have to look at the record, and the record is horrible in terms of partisanship. Yeah. So, and also in terms of pursuing hysterical Russian fabricated sort of general fantasies and fictions about Russian interference that seems to be in vogue in especially NATO member states.
Well, we'll be talking a bit more about that in a moment. But in the meantime, let me welcome Mark Anderson to the program. Mark, what do you make of, just briefly, what do you make of what we've been discussing, the first part of the program?
Well, I don't know if you want to bring up the front cover of the Economist magazine that I sent in on what to expect in 2019.
We're going to do that last.
Oh, okay. I'll save some ammo for that. But I would add that this is going global according to the outlook of The Economist, and we'll cover that in a few minutes. But it involves Facebook, and it's really absolutely underhanded the way they're going about building one narrative and one narrative only, one world viewpoint, and that's it. But we'll get to that in just a moment. I believe you wanted to talk about the Rand Paul resolution.
Yes, let's talk about the Rand Paul resolution. So we're talking about Yemen here, and there has been some action in the Senate to end U.S. support for the war in Yemen. How has that progressed? Have they succeeded in doing that?
Not totally succeeded. There was 2 votes back in the summer, one in August by the Senate and in September by the House. And there was other bills, but mainly Senate Joint Resolution 54, and I believe 21st Century Wire has covered this too, so people might want to check that out as well. And that vote just happened on the 13th, I believe it was. Yeah, 13th of December, 56-41. The Senate passed Senate Joint Resolution 54. And for the first time since the Vietnam War, the Senate voted to prevent a president from involving the U.S. in war. And that's according to Rand Paul's official press release. And I talked to his people about it recently, and they said the vote would come about mid-December, and sure enough, it did. And what his press release noted was today, November 13th, in an historic vote, the Senate sent a clear message to Saudi Arabia that we will not turn a blind eye to their abuse of human rights, killing of dissidents and innocent Yemenis, and fueling of a humanitarian crisis. Since entering the Senate, I, Rand Paul, have spoken out against Congress's abdication of its constitutional responsibilities in foreign policy, and I've worked across the aisle, which he has, to help build a bipartisan consensus that made its voice loudly heard today. I will continue working to ensure that today's victory is just the beginning of a long-awaited change in how Congress operates. And what's notable here is while Donald Trump has done a lot to shun and counterbalance and counteract the New World Order in its more recent strides, this is definitely a weak spot in the Trump administration's overall policy, particularly in its foreign policy, of still involving us in what Obama started in this deplorable situation in Yemen. So those of us that have given at least some measure of support to the Trump regime for counteracting the New World Order are still waiting to see what the Trump White House is going to do in this. But Rand Paul, unlike any other, is really taking the lead and really walking out on a limb to make this issue, to get it out there front and center where it belongs, because it is definitely the weak spot in the overall Trump administration.
So, Pat, what are the key caveats then?
Well, we did publish an article a few days ago at 21st Century Wire. We'll just have a look at it. So, yes, the Senate, for the first time, Mark pointed out rightly, this is invoking the War Powers Act, the first time really since 1973. But there's a couple of key caveats, Mike, in here, and let's just have a look at those. Some of the key caveats. The first one is that the United States armed forces engaged in operations directed at al-Qaeda or associated forces, and also nothing in this joint resolution shall be construed to influence or disrupt any military operations in cooperation with Israel. So if you look at, those are two important caveats, and there's another here as well, whereas Congress has not declared war with respect to or provided any specific statutory authorization for the conflict between military forces led by Saudi Arabia, including its allies, the UAE, Bahrain, et cetera, No mention of the UK, Mike, in this list. So the UK has been conveniently expunged from the wording in these very important key provisions in this resolution. And so if we just look, al-Qaeda and Israel. So these are the two joker cards that the United States is keeping in its deck. And of course, al-Qaeda can conveniently appear anywhere, not least of all in the Arabian Peninsula. And you'll see the term AQAP, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, that will become in vogue probably as and when the CIA or as and when the Pentagon needs to get into Yemen. They will invoke the al-Qaeda ghost. But in fact, there are al-Qaeda cells operating there. There have been accusations of the United States working, providing some indirect support at least to these, and as well Saudi Arabia too, Mike. So, and they're using the al-Qaeda as a convenient ally, let's say, or the enemy of my enemy is my friend, in order to fight the Houthi rebels in Yemen. And so the similar could be said with other groups, like in Syria, we see this as well. And of course, Israel is a convenient caveat to put in there. So they've inserted that into that legislation. But where's the UK? And it's important to point out, Mike, that the UK, as we said a few weeks ago, is no mere bystander in the Yemeni war. It is an active player. These were the words of Ian Blackford, MP. He is the SNP Westminster leader, and he said, recently, at least last month, The UK government is no mere bystander in the war. It's an active player. Despite the mounting evidence of breaches in international law, the UK government is still content on looking the other way while simultaneously supplying arms and military advice to the Saudi government. The sale of arms to Saudi government must end now. So it's pretty clear, Mike, that's been an issue. It's been an issue in the press, Mike, since 2016 and 2017. This is only a year and a half ago. UK bombs sold to Saudi Arabia contributed to 81 unlawful acts in Yemen, say human rights activists. And so there's a number of open investigations, Mike, and a lot of these involve UK arms. And the same could be said for the United States, but a lot of people will know that and talk about that widely, but nobody really addresses Britain's role in the Yemeni conflict. But
so there's Theresa. But Patrick, you mentioned that Israel was part of this as well in that legislation. But Mark, Israel, Rand Paul was also attacking funding for Israel recently. So how did that end up?
Well, it seems to be right on the brink of a vote from what I've gathered. And this is interesting that Rand Paul, and I appreciate what Patrick is saying, there's some very unwelcome and unfortunate exceptions in the matter with Yemen, that Senate joint resolution. But yeah, with Israel now, Rand Paul is taking the very rare and gutsy step of wanting to interrupt and debate and possibly filibuster the annual appropriation of foreign aid, which is $38 billion over 10 years to Israel. And maybe this is Rand Paul's way of sort of obliquely coming at this issue, since Israel, like the UK, is omitted from the Yemen matter. But this takes a lot of courage. This is something that's going to be a vote any day, evidently. So we're going to watch this real closely. And I'll be posting this on my blog, thetruthhound.com, fairly soon as to what results from this. But this is something that most all senators and House members just will not touch with a 1,000-foot pole or a 2-foot pole. So we'll see what happens here. But if he could get any traction on this to call more attention to this, that would be really unprecedented. And the details are yet to be forthcoming. Coming as the official foreign aid to Israel being $38 billion over 10 years. It's of course much more. The late Jim Trafficant pointed out that with low interest loans, no interest loans, payments in kind, the annual foreign aid to Israel, rather than being $3.8 billion each year, is probably more like $10 billion or approaching that each year. So it's a vast amount of money for which Israel is very unaccountable, and the U.S. really gets nothing out of that relationship. And the website ifamericans.org is very instrumental in pointing that out, that the U.S. gets the short end of the stick in a big way.
Okay. Any thoughts?
Well, I would say the U.S. does get something out of that relationship. Every member of Congress and the Senate get a big fat check from the Israeli lobby if they're on board with the program. And a lot of this was detailed in the 4-part documentary series by Al Jazeera called The Lobby, that was leaked online recently after it had been spiked from being broadcast. But you can watch that at electronicintifada.com, and that really details, Mike, this kind of circular, in a way, a money laundering, where money goes from the U.S. taxpayer, goes to Israel, and then also filters back to the United States through various Israeli lobby firms, and then back into the pockets of congressmen, senators, and other government officials to sort of buy their loyalty. And not only that, Mike, if you're not on board with the agenda, which Rand Paul is setting himself up to be a target by the Israeli lobby machine, and what they will do, they will finance, Mike, a candidate to run against you in the next election if you're not on the program. And so Rand Paul, look for a major challenge to his Senate seat in the next election, and that guaranteed his opponent will receive a lot of money and support from the Israeli lobby. If other case studies are anything to go by, and a lot of this, again, was detailed in the 4-part documentary series, The Lobby, which you can watch online for free now. Go and watch it while it's still up there.
Okay, but Saudi Arabia condemning this U.S. Senate interference?
Yes, well, this is more of using this term interference. This is kind of in vogue. Everybody can accuse somebody of interfering. So here Saudi Arabia is using this, calling this this resolution as being interference in Saudi affairs, if you can believe it or not. So they are claiming meddling by the United States into Saudi affairs. Kind of interesting, but ridiculous at the same time.
Yes. Now, just briefly, we'll mention this because it leads into the integrity initiative stuff. But over the weekend, Petro Poroshenko announced that Ukraine has chosen the new head for their new national Orthodox Church. Now, we were talking about this on the Sunday Wire last night, Patrick, because this is a pretty significant split between the Orthodox Church in Ukraine and obviously in Russia. And as you can see there, he's saying this day will go into history as a sacred day, the day of the final independence from Russia. He apparently was saying this to people, and they were responding with glory, glory, glory. So this is fantastic stuff for Ukraine, but it's got to be, it's just another provocation, is it not?
Look at this guy up on screen here. Do you know what his approval rating is? I don't know. It's just hovering in the single digits. It's near the single digits, Mike. So they've got an election coming up in the Ukraine. This gentleman is extremely unpopular. He is effectively a puppet president installed by the United States. That's pretty well accepted as fact by anybody who's honestly looking at this situation since February 2014. So Petro Poroshenko is basically he's the guy that is helping Washington achieve all of its objectives with regards to setting the Ukraine up as a sort of a hostile actor right on Russia's border, and obviously sandwiched between the EU and Russia. So I can't underestimate, Mike, how important the forced breakup of the Orthodox churches and the CIA's role in that has already been alluded to by many analysts, and there is some evidence to support that claim as well. So this is about a lot of things, Mike, which we discussed on the show last night. I do encourage people to listen to the Sunday Wire. We had Jay Dyer, who is very well versed in this topic and also the history of this specific involvement by Western influences to sort of infiltrate religious institutions in order to divide it, Mike. It's also to try to divide and conquer in terms of the Eastern Front. And that's how the West sees it. This game has been going on a long time, obviously.
Well, look, this Eastern Front is hugely important. So this just came in literally 2 minutes before we came on air, so I didn't get time to prepare a graphic for it. But this is now the third visit to NATO by a senior Ukrainian in the last 2 weeks. So tomorrow there will be the visit to NATO by the Vice Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine. That was Poroshenko was there last week, and the head of the Ukrainian Parliament was there the week before. So there's no media opportunity for this once again. So, but we're seeing increased activity between NATO and Ukrainian officials at this time. Yesterday, David Scott published this article in the UK Columnist with regard to Integrity Initiative, half a league onwards, a glimpse into the policy protocols of the Integrity Initiative. And he's talking about the director of Integrity Initiative, Nigel Donnelly, and really making the point that Donnelly is promoting war policy in everything that he's doing. He's calling for war between Ukraine and Russia. In this case, as this article points out, we look at what's going on the ground in Ukraine. We look at the meetings with NATO. We look at the propaganda that's being pushed out through the likes of the Integrity Initiative. And this is all Western activity, which seems to be running along the lines of Western accusations of what Russia is doing. So is this just the policy that we've chosen, is to do what we say that the other side is doing? Is that how this is going to work from now on?
That's how it's worked from the beginning, Mike. This is what the Integrity Initiative is. It's set up to frame Russia, to create the Russian threat, essentially, by injecting and planting stories throughout the Western mainstream media. And of course that percolates up into the mouths of politicians, and you hear the same recycled talking points spoken by elected officials in the West, repeating basically what they've read in the Times or in the Guardian or any of the other fake news publications in the mainstream. So essentially in terms of the Ukraine, Mike, the Ukraine is being set up as cannon fodder for a Western agenda. It is not in the interests of the people of the Ukraine, of the country of the Ukraine, to fight or to be in a military conflict with Russia. It's simply not. And so all the narratives are being spun around to justify this aggressive stance, the propping up of the puppet Petro Poroshenko, and who knows who's going to come after him. I would imagine somebody maybe even more vociferous, maybe more pro-Western, and maybe more anti-Russian. I hope not. But that's always a danger, Mike, because they've also been helping to fund and to support a sort of a grassroots fascist movement in the Ukraine. And I'm not talking about weekend warriors in Charlottesville, West Virginia, with Walmart $7 tiki torches and T-shirts they bought on Amazon. I'm talking about real hardcore Banderites, people that pay homage to the Nazi heroes like Stefan Bandera and street fascists, basically. That was the vanguard that helped the putsch, which happened in February 2014, where a democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, was forced out of office, and then a Western-picked, hand-picked replacement, hand-picked by the words of Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt, U.S. officials at the time, who were hand-picking the Ukrainian cabinet. And of course, Poroshenko fit the bill for a number of reasons. So that's the real history, Mike. Integrity's job is to reverse that and to spin it and to give you a different version of it that will justify a new Cold War and an arms race between the West and the East.
Well, it's a massive disinformation campaign in its own right, as we've shown on the UK column. A number of other outlets doing some good work on this. Moon of Alabama. Actually, Sputnik had a really good article last week on the Integrity Initiative, because they tracked down the actual office location and attempted to speak to somebody in there and got thrown out very quickly. If you can track that down, have a look. But we're starting to see a bit of a reaction from mainstream press and some of the key players. I mean, Edward Lucas, we're going to look at in a second. But the narrative that they seem to want to go down, there seems to be two prongs to it. One is they've jumped on this issue of the Labour Party that Emily Thornberry raised in the House of Commons last week. And this is Edward Lucas writing in the Times. Don't swallow Labour claims of black ops. We're playing into the Kremlin's hands, he says, by letting it undermine our anti-propaganda institute. So the Integrity Initiative and the Institute for Statecraft, this is our anti-propaganda institute. We can debate who "our" means or what that word means in this case. He says the deep state's machinations have been exposed. The government is secretly funding taxpayers' money to a black ops propaganda unit that meddles in friendly countries' affairs and spreads disinformation about the Labour Party leadership. This is the gist of the accusations against the Foreign Office-funded Institute for Statecraft and its Counter-Disinformation Integrity Initiative. Now, you see, even by suggesting that it's simply Foreign Office funded, that downplays the situation. The Integrity Initiative, run through the Institute for Statecraft, is a program of the Foreign Office's counter-disinformation and media development program. This is pretty significant, but this is the other prong of the attack. This is from James Ball, who I believe is Guardian and other places he writes for, and he's saying, final thought for now, amazing how these guys, this is the people like us explaining what Integrity Initiative is, how these guys want to dive into every detail of Integrity Initiative, but have basically zero curiosity about how an organization set up to tackle Russian misinformation ended up being hacked with its information posted online. Ring any bells? So the other part of their counter-narrative seems to be that really we shouldn't be worried about what the documents say. We should only be worried about the fact that that these documents ended up being published as a result of a Russian hack. But of course, there's no evidence that it was even a hack. We simply know that these documents have been published, and they could very well have been leaked, Patrick.
There's no proof that's been presented yet that Russia hacked integrity to get these documents. It could have very well been a leak. This is the identical situation you have with the DNC leaks, which the U.S. And the mainstream media are absolutely adamant about. That was a hack. It was a Russian hack, and it was handed to WikiLeaks and so forth. So it's the exact same pattern, Mike, of obfuscation and zero accountability by journalists themselves who are named, many of them named in the integrity leaks, and then they're forced to go out in public and defend what is clearly a dodgy operation. And it's not an anti-propaganda. It's funny they use the term, this is our anti-propaganda operation, Mike. It is a propaganda operation. It is not an anti-propaganda operation. Multiple times we have challenged these journalists to produce one example at least, or at least one or two examples of the sort of, 3,000 item output per week by Russian English language media outlets. Just show us one or two examples of Russian disinformation, of Russian propaganda or fake news, and they haven't been able to produce any, which is a bit of a problem, Mike.
Well, it is a problem because we're able to produce so many. So what on earth is the Daily Mail talking about here?
Well, we're able to produce so many Western mainstream media disinformation articles, and you obviously this is like shooting fish in a barrel, looking through the Daily Mail. But they had this zinger up this week, and we thought we'd add this to our collection in the Hall of Fame of Russian anti-Russian fake news. And the headline here is that this is a man from Luton who apparently took a samurai sword. He's an Uber cab driver from Luton, took a samurai sword and went outside somewhere near Buckingham Palace, we're told. Not in front of Buckingham Palace, but in the vicinity, which means implies a threat to the royal family. Pulled out a samurai sword, and apparently the interesting thing about this, we'll go back, is that there's his knife sharpener there. This is from the CCTV cameras in Sainsbury's, where his sister worked, I believe. So he was buying a knife sharpener, plus this dodgy samurai sword. Apparently got out in a parking lot, waved the sword around, and here we have a story. And apparently, when asked why he did it, he said, "I was watching RT, and it made me angry." Right? And so apparently he's also an ISIS sympathizer because a friend said he might have said something on WhatsApp a few months ago that said he supported ISIS. So this is an ISIS supporting radical who was finally radicalized, pushed over the edge by Vladimir Putin. And of course, we've used the Russian English RT bilingual logo there because it's more villainous with the little Russian character there for RT. So there's Putin. You can blame him for this latest one. Mike, when will it end?
I do not know when it will end, but I'll tell you, unfortunately, this program has to more or less end. So we've got to jump right to the end and say to Mark, of course, Edward Lucas used to work for The Economist. He used to be a significant senior editor at The Economist. Well, they have just produced their view of the world in 2019, Mark. What on earth are we looking forward to in the next 12 months?
Well, this Bilderberg connected publication, I could go on about a lot of things, about them talking about that we have to tackle voter fraud, and they have their panties in a bunch about the U.S. having regulations where people have to show an ID at the polling place just to vote, as if that's some terrible thing to prove that you're a citizen of this country when we have such a huge migration problem, especially lately. But the thing I would just wrap up your show with is the article in there about social media, and they're talking about how to control social media globally, because they want, on the one hand, more connectivity throughout the world, more people to be online than ever before. They say that's a good thing. And yet they're saying that perhaps we need to get more people online, but that effort should be slowed down until they're better equipped to handle the technology. And what they're actually talking about here is they want the internet to expand, connectivity to expand, but they want one narrative, a one world viewpoint. And they say things like, yet the internet and the social media platforms built on top of it do not just have the potential to boost growth and development, they can also cause serious trouble, quote unquote. This has been much talked about in rich countries in the wake of the online misinformation campaigns that were a factor in Americans electing Donald Trump as president and a factor in Britons voting for Brexit. So, to sum it up, they want more connectivity. It's a wonderful thing to have. You know, everybody's online. We're one big happy family. But they don't want people getting any ideas about actual democracy and objective information. They want to have more connectivity, and WhatsApp is mentioned, by the way. Having more Facebook employees in different countries around the world is also mentioned. And so how do we have more connectivity but still have this one world viewpoint with one narrative and keep the competition out? That's what it boils down to.
I mean, this is a problem for them, Patrick, because if we look back at, Barack Obama was really the first presidential candidate who used social media effectively in order to drive his campaign. He did that and ended up being elected as president. Trump did what Obama did on steroids. But in the past, this has been something which perhaps only people with those kinds of budgets understood the rules of social media and how to amplify, as they like to say, narratives. Unfortunately for them, ordinary people have discovered how to use social media effectively. It's not just being used for putting photographs of parties and family members online. It's actually being used to distribute information. So how do they maintain this single narrative? Integrity Initiative is clearly a part of it, but look how much money they're piling into programs like the Integrity Initiative. And what we're seeing with the Integrity Initiative is we're only scratching the surface with that. So my question, Pat, is how much money do they have to spend to produce a single global narrative? And is it possible for them to achieve that, or are they going to collapse under the effort?
Well, look, we can look at this, Mike, and we're going to have this discussion. It has to be within the framework of the Russian threat. Because, Mike, only a decade ago, all of this money was being plowed into the war on terror to fight radical Islamic terror, or to fight radicalism, to fight ISIS after that. And that's where that was the gravy train, Mike, in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of all sorts of different contracting, Department of Homeland Security, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. Okay, so now the new one is Russian interference, and election interference. So they've created a fake situation, a completely fabricated situation. Now, there is some reality to this, Mike. I won't say this is completely a non-event, Mike. The threat is inflated, yes, but the reality is, Mike, that audiences on Twitter and Facebook are global. So elections will be influenced in the social media realm by global audiences. In other words, a gang of people in Japan can jump on board the Trump train, or can jump on board the Bernie Sanders train, or whatever train that is, the Brexit train, the Remain train. It's a global audience that could influence the Remain camp and make it create a tsunami on Twitter and on Facebook. Okay, that's a reality of living in a 21st century internet social media age. How are nation states going to deal with that problem? How are they going to factor that in? Because you do have a global audience, Mike, outside influence coming in and affecting all of every single election, even a local election, even the state election in Texas. Beto O'Rourke, who ran for Senate, who lost to Ted Cruz, he had a global movement behind him because of this. Because of social media platforms and because his ideas resonated with various progressives around the world, so they all jumped in to support Beto O'Rourke. So what does that mean, Mike? That means when you're campaigning, even for a local seat, you are campaigning, you're running with a global audience, even for a local election. This does present fundamental problems, Mike, to the old concept of elections, of national elections, of local elections. So clearly the governments in the UK and the US and Europe, they don't want to compete in the marketplace of ideas with networks like RT. or Sputnik. So instead of competing against them, they've created a sort of straw man, and they've accused them of being disinformation outlets run by the evil Vladimir Putin. So they've contained that narrative for now within that sort of evil, nefarious Cold War framework, Mike, but it's not going to be able to be contained in there forever. This is a much bigger issue that right now they're using Russia to sort of work through this issue and compartmentalize the internet, but really you're looking at a fundamental structural shift, structural change here. And I don't know exactly where this is going to end up, actually, Mike. I think we're in the early stages, actually, of this.
Okay, final thoughts, Mark.
Yeah, kudos to what Patrick said. Basically, it's a huge misdirection campaign to get everybody looking one way while they're doing something else. In other words, to overlook the fact that that Facebook and all these outlets are really misleading people, and to continue to keep Facebook and these social media outlets as the dominant outlets. But what the Economist is not addressing, I'm collecting my thoughts very early here in Texas, what they're not addressing is all the competition to the social media that's coming up. There's even a new social media called Trump Town, where people by the thousands are dropping their Facebook accounts and going to Trump Town, among other alternatives. So the real issue that the Economist is overlooking, in my opinion, is that there's going to be a lot more social media outlets out there in due time. And so Facebook's quasi-monopoly probably will and should come to an end. That's something to really look for. That's the true thing to look forward to in 2019, is more competition and more options, rather than Facebook and Google always controlling the game and wanting to have this informational monopoly, much like the Fed has a monetary monopoly and other such monopoly.
Okay, well, look, we're going to continue this conversation in a moment for UK Column News Extra Time for UK Column members and 21st Century Wire members, because there is an issue there, Mark, with regard to I'm going to call it the balkanization of the internet. I think this is an important discussion to have, but we'll have that in a moment for members. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for joining us, Patrick, and thank you for joining us, Mark. We'll be back at the same time, 1 p.m. as usual on Wednesday, and we'll see you then. Bye-bye.